You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 337 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. And I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's a balmy 70 degrees. Nothing like the weather we're going to see in 27 days for the Cubs opener. I promise you that.
There's no chance. There is no chance we'll sniff anything this nice as it's been these weird February days. But to help us count down to get to opening day, to talk all things spring training, Cubs news, longtime friend of the show, you know him from his work at BleacherNation.com. Please welcome back Brett Taylor. Thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Hey, happy to do it, especially this time of year when things are joyful and anticipatory, and this is a good time to do it. So thanks for having me on.
This is my favorite time of the baseball season. Typically,
this is the mystery box time of the season, right? Like this season, it could be anything. It could be really good.
What if, right? Just what if everywhere.
Yep, all up and down the lineup. It's not
Nobody
likely
gets hurt.
they all.
Everybody does well.
It's not likely they all put up 7 WAR seasons, but what if they did? That'd be crazy.
What if Morel hits 40 home runs? I mean, it could.
Yeah, it could. Hey, he hit like 36 last year. Between the levels, so
yeah.
Well, one thing we'll start out. We'll dig into the news, and we'll start with one of the what ifs. What if Ian Happ is not going to be ready for opening day? He is coming off an injury, first injury really of spring training to note, a mild left hamstring strain for Ian Happ. Sahadev Sharma, friend of the show, says that he on his X post that. There's optimism that he'll be good to go for opening day. Brett, what are you hearing talking to your folks out there? And how's Ian Happ looking? And if he's not going to be ready for opening day, what are some of the options you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to think about when it comes just to the injury itself. Anything in spring training, and this we talk about this every single year, and because it happens every single year. Teams and players are going to be overly cautious about anything in spring training. And so it can be sometimes a little harder to get a gauge on just how serious something is or isn't. So tentatively, unless it's a surgery situation, you maybe worry a little less in spring training, not the least of which because the games that he's missing right now don't count. So you've got that. The second thing, though, to think about is with hamstring strains, we know historically, this is not specific to Ian Happ or this injury. It's just a general thing with baseball players and hamstring strains. Even mild ones frequently cost about a month. That's just the nature of this particular injury. And so I think based on that and based on the fact that they are sort of affirmatively calling it a mild strain, I'd be a little surprised if he's back into game action in enough time to get up to speed, feel good to go for the regular season. Keep in mind, you can IL a guy at the end of spring training, backdate it 3 days. And so for a position player, you're talking about a week. He'd only miss a week. And if that extra week gives him a little more comfort, gives the Cubs a little more comfort, I don't know how much harm there is in going that route. And that'll lead into the second half of your question as well. If that happens, what do the Cubs do? And before I touch on that, I just want to say none of this is to say it's a good thing that Ian Happ might miss time.
No,
I think he's perennially one of the most underrated players on the team. I don't know if it's because, well, my working theory is because he came up on the tail end of the wave of those sort of superstar prospects, and because he was also a top 10 pick and top 30 prospect in baseball, there was sort of, if he was anything shy of that superstar level, people were going to be disappointed and irrationally foist upon him expectations that were maybe unfair. And so I think from thing one, people have just expected him to be something he isn't. And what he is just a very good player. He's a player that, 18 teams probably would love to have as their left fielder. So anyway, it sucks that he might miss some time. But if you were going to pick a spot on the roster for the Cubs to be missing some time, especially to open the season, I don't know that you could go better than left field, because that is a spot where the Cubs have a number of not even just reasonable coverage options. They have some like actually interesting options, and we can go through them.
Like. How about that spot? Could they go without the Drew Smiley spot for a week?
Oh gosh, it'll be very interesting. The Cubs, I think, pretty quickly are going to have to decide whether they can move him, and it's a pretty substantial contract. $12 million plus incentives to a team that might still want to try him as a starting pitcher, or the Cubs are just going to flip the switch and put him in the bullpen where he was great last year. Like I personally would not have a beef with that. But it does, you wish he was showing out a little bit more right now, because that would leave the Cubs with more options. In any case, as to left field, I think, again, we can go through the coverage options, but I'm kind of loving that spot as an opportunity for the Cubs to maybe sort of extend some of their spring training decisions. Like, let's imagine a world where Happ's going to be out for a week. As a guy who could be on the roster then pretty easily is Alexander Canario, who may not otherwise have a spot, not just a starting spot. He may not quite have a spot on the 26-man roster. But if Happ's out, you've got all those starts in left field. Why not give him that run? Why not just say, okay, fine, you take it for this week? That would not be a terrible outcome. And if it's not him, of course, we know Mike Tauchman, fantastic fourth outfielder. He would be certainly more than fine there. I don't think the Cubs would go the route of keeping Pete Crow Armstrong up and putting Cody in left field to cover. That might give you your best outfield defense. But I tend to think the Cubs' decision on PCA is going to be either he's making the team and he's sort of full go part of the team, or he's going to go to Iowa for the first part of the season to continue working on some of those approach changes at the plate, getting to the elevated stuff. And there's other creative routes. We just saw Miles Mastrobuoni out there in left field.
Last year's starter in right field, right?
I know. It's so funny you say that, because when this happened and then Mastrobuoni was in left field right away, and I think Craig Counsell even said something about, not that he would replace Happ, but it was something to the effect of, it's nice to have him able to go out into the outfield. I immediately thought of those early season games where he was in right field. Do you remember when he didn't dive for the one where they could have won that game? I don't think that was the opener, but it was that first week. And it was just like, all you had to do is dive. And I know that's mean, because you can't assume a guy's going to catch a ball if he has to dive for it. But that has been, especially in a season where they missed the playoffs by one game, that anytime I think of Mastrobuoni in the outfield, that's what I think of. I do like him on the roster, though. I think very, very valuable, versatile player.
So, Jeremy, I agree with Brett about basically the outline of the injury and the timetable. Really, we're looking at starting the season about 3 weeks, right? So that's kind of tight. And the schedule actually does Happ no favors. They start in Texas for 3 games, but then they come home for 7 days, a week in likely snow and sleet-like conditions starting April 1st. If it were reversed, maybe you hold him out the first 3 games and then you send him down to Texas where it's 78. I'd feel much more comfortable if he was playing in like room temperature rather than having to play, at whatever the conditions are going to be like at Wrigley in April. So it does give other people an opportunity. There's always the possibility he could DH too, which is another, depending on how things work out. But I have a feeling that if he's able to DH, he's probably able to play outfield too. So they probably just do it all for, it's either all or nothing, I'm guessing. I like the idea of having Canario come up and get a week's worth of action, No offense to Mike Tauchman. I know everybody loves him. I like having him as a kind of a utility guy and a backup guy. Canario's more the future. Tauchman's sort of like just a guy, right? So this is the opportunity for a young player to get up here and get some at bats he might not otherwise get. And then if he pushes the envelope and he's hot, then you do get to have this fun game of, well, who DHs now and who does this? And likewise, I think PCA pretty much has to go back to the minors, I'm guessing, at first here. I think the Cubs are invested in trying Bush at first, which I think is fair given what they gave up for him. And that means Bellinger plays center. And I don't think they're going to start the season bouncing Bellinger from spot to spot. I think they'll probably start him in center or start Bush at first. And they don't have to rush with PCA either. That's the beauty of it. You know, he's a young player. I am sure he'll be up at some point this season, barring a Brendan Davis-like career. And, you know, who, by the way, wouldn't that have been nice if Brendan Davis had been hot all spring and he could have come up and played in the outfield? Alas, hitting the head with a pitch. If that guy didn't have bad luck, he'd have no luck at all. And now they're saying, well, he's going to slowly start baseball activities, but that means like we won't see him in a major league spring training game, you know, for the rest of the spring. He'll be in the minor league camp and hopefully resurface at some point. But yeah, that poor guy. That would have been a fairy tale story, right? If he had been able to catch fire at age 24 and in spring training and then have a spot on the roster open up for him like that. But I think the Cubs will be fine. It's definitely a contrast from the last couple of seasons when they were so paper thin everywhere, where they would start the season with guys who weren't really major league caliber players in the lineup. Like now I feel like they have major league caliber players throughout the lineup. So if one of them gets hurt, they also have younger guys who will eventually be major league players. Whether they are right now or not, we'll find out. But at least they're not playing from a complete disadvantage like they have been. So
you reminded me. Sorry to jump in, but I forgot to mention David Peralta, who's on a non-roster minor league deal. That, again, in his case, you know, veteran experienced. He was dealing with an arm issue last year that may have sapped some of his numbers. Had surgery. He's better now. It was going to take something like this for him to have a chance to make the roster. So don't want to rule him out. But I liked your point that with Canario, you are not only potentially getting the performance, you're also getting information. You know, you have an opportunity that Canario is not going to get starts unless something like this happens. And so why not take that opportunity? And then, as you perfectly put it, if he's crushing the ball, then maybe you figure something out with the DH and you sort of rotate guys and make it work. And I do like that possibility.
And we talked about it last week. We thought last week that Canario can get streaky. He can get hot and he can get really cold. So if you can heat him up early and ride it as long as you can, and then make the move when he cools off again. Like I think you were going to mention, Pat, Council's actually a manager who would play him.
He's bold, right? I feel like if David Ross were here, there's no doubt Peralta would be or Mastrobuoni would be the starting left field. They just would be, you know. But you know, at least for Bleacher Jeff's sake, if you can't have Ian Happ, you know, we should probably throw out Canario out there to give us something interesting to see, you know.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the starting rotation, and we've seen a couple. We got to see Imanaga pitch in the spring. That was exciting. We a lot of eyes on that. So. Your initial thoughts, Brett? I know it's just getting to see someone we're excited about, a free agent signing. We were excited to see him, and we got to see a new player play in spring training. What were your initial thoughts and thoughts on the rotation as a whole going into this season? Do you feel like they're done and this is it?
I'm glad you framed the Shota question that way, because I think sometimes we forget, especially in a spring training game, it can just be fun to see a new guy arrive. It was not only new to the Cubs, he's new to the United States, he's new to Major League Baseball. And like, that's very much how I felt. It was a Saturday, so I was like with my kids in the basement. I had my computer up and I'm watching, and my son, who's 11, is like glued to my shoulder wanting to watch because he's been hearing about Imanaga all off season. And I'm like, this is good. This is what it's supposed to be. And there were no stakes. So it was nice. I wasn't stressed out and screaming at anything. Like when the 3-run homer went, I wasn't freaking out. The performance was it was funny how spot on it was to what we were expecting from him, which is variety of pitches, ton of swing and miss, ton of fly balls. One of them leaves the park. And that's kind of what we know is the potential adjustment coming for Imanaga because of, I wrote about it earlier today at Bleacher Nation, because his fastball, his four-seamer specifically, the pitch characteristics and the vertical attack angle from which he comes is so unique, is so, if you were doing a plot graph of his pitch, it'd be one of these outliers. A lot like Justin Steele's is an outlier. They're not similar pitches, but just extreme. And we know it can play against big league hitters. We know. But the rub is he's going to have to locate it, and he's going to have to locate it up, which is not something that he's used to doing because that's not, for a variety of reasons, that's not the way you use those pitches in Japan because you're not going to get that strike call. Hitters don't swing at the highest stuff in Japan. And so that's going to be an adjustment for him. And a lot of his success may ride on how well he can locate that one pitch up because then everything else plays off of that. So it was fun to see. And in a way, you're glad that he threw one thigh high and it got walloped. You almost wanted that to happen every outing in spring training. So it's like, get that new muscle memory in there, Rotationally, generally, I love the Cubs depth. I think I can't remember the last, we're used to them having like a fifth starter competition in spring training. It's last many years, but I can't remember the last time they had four guys going for the fifth starter spot that, you could almost pick a name out of the hat and I'd be like, oh, okay, I understand that. I understand that decision. I think we're starting to get some clarity, like we talked about earlier with Drew Smiley. I think, he probably had the leg up coming in mostly because of roster reasons. He can't be optioned to the minors. There's a lot of value there if he can stick in the rotation. And we've seen stretches from him for sure, where he was a very good starting pitcher. And we've seen stretches where he was a disaster of a starting pitcher. So I still wouldn't rule out that he might be the guy, even as Jordan Wicks just threw his third straight solid spring game. We have to remember, these decisions are like, I forget who said, I feel like Jed Hoyer said at one time that it's not that you completely ignore spring training performance when you make these edge case decisions. It's that it might mean like 5%. It's a very small piece of the puzzle. And I think what Wicks has going against him is the option. He can be sent to the minors easily. Ditto Hayden Wisniewski, but he can also be put in the bullpen, which might end up the best place for him anyway, because through his two outings, we're still not seeing that success against lefties. And then Javier Assad, who once again is like sort of the quiet guy in the background, but was the most effective pitcher last year. We know he can swing in and out of the rotation in the bullpen, and he too has options remaining. And so I suppose to circle back to the point, it's not just that the Cubs have four decent options for that fifth spot. It's that they have so much flexibility among them. Like, guys can be in the bullpen, guys can be at Iowa, guys that the stakes to this decision are simply who's going to make those starts. It's not, we might have to lose this guy on waivers, or we might stunt this guy's development, because nobody's really at that point. So I dig that. And for that reason, and also just for some financial reasons that have become, I think, clear to all of us over the last couple months, I just don't think the Cubs are going to be aggressively pushing to that second tier of the luxury tax right now. And so I don't see them being sort of late players on Jordan Montgomery or Blake Snell. Candidly, Blake Snell has never quite made sense to me from the jump, because to me there's some unique risks there, especially even on a short-term deal. The price tag he's going to command is going to be substantial, and you lose a draft pick with him. Jordan Montgomery, there were arguments I could see making sense, but I think the price to which he would have to fall for the Cubs to slide in and be interested would be so depressed that 10 other teams would jump in at that point as well. So yeah, I would say by and large, Cubs are probably done now. And I think it's going to be internal decisions about how to formulate that initial 26 and then how to best carry that forward through the season.
So let's start off with this notion that you have an 11-year-old son. When we started this podcast, you were having a baby. I guess that's him, huh?
I was going to say which one. Yeah, we've got a 13, we got 11, and we got a 7.
Yeah,
so it
I
could have
think
been
11.
any of those. Yeah, it's oh man. Yeah, I started doing this job full time after the first one. Had the first kid, and I was like, okay. I was a lawyer in a past life, and I was like, that's not going to work for me, and so went into this role. But yeah, they've been a part of this from the jump. But I can't get my son's a little into the Cubs. He's very into baseball, but he's only a little into the Cubs. The girls, they couldn't care less about it, unfortunately. So I got to keep working on him a little bit. He's a big Christopher Morel fan. So like if Morel has a huge season, that would go a long way to cementing my son's Cubs fandom. So if you're out there, Chris, come on, hook me up.
My daughter made me very happy tonight at the dinner table when she said, yeah, we should go to a Cubs game this year. I'm like, oh, really? Because we do every year, a lot of them. But yes, we should. That'd be fun. Yeah. It's nice to hear her. I mean, we live like 2.5 blocks away, so it's not like a far trip. But yeah, I feel like it's nice to hear some enthusiasm from my kid. Waxes and wanes a little bit. But as far as the rotation is concerned, last year at this time, I think the big breakout story was the domination by Hayden Wisniewski of spring training. Another reason why I try not to even look at the actual numbers because, the year before that it was Jason Hayward, 7 home runs, and it's just a nonstop game of Lucy and the football and your Charlie Brown, right? So I agree. The Cubs do have a lot of options that they can go to. Council does, and this is kind of where he kind of makes his money, right? Like making these types of decisions, tinkering with it. I mean, look, if they start with Wicks and then they decide they want to move to somebody else, that's fine. They could have Wisniewski in the bullpen and Smiley. They can mix and match. I think if they have a game canceled early in the year at some point, you might see them go to with some of the off days. You know how that is early on. You might skip a guy once, or with Imanaga, they might want to not skip a guy so he has extra rest. Who knows, right? But I do think that when I look at the Cubs roster, to the extent that we can take Ian Happ, who's probably the most consistent player on the team, and feel comfortable in his missing a little bit of time, the one area where I don't think we can sustain an injury, probably, at least as it's currently formulated, would be the starting rotation. Like if Justin Steele were to go down tomorrow and be out for a month, we'd be in trouble, right? Like the Cubs just don't have anybody else sort of top of the rotation who you can say, oh yeah, I'm not worried. It's not like the Lester Arrieta Hendricks combination of the mid 2000 teens. We're really basically, let's hope Justin Steele outperforms his sabermetric expectations again, and let's hope Imanaga comes up and is as good as we're hoping he'll be. Let's hope that Teon, turns it around like he sort of started to in the second half last year and the last couple of months, and not be the pitcher. If he starts off this year for the first 3.5 months with an ERA of 5.60 or whatever, we're in trouble. Let's hope that Kyle Hendricks has another year left in that arm, and can pitch like he did last year. You got a lot of question marks. So yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, I think a Jordan Montgomery, especially on one of these 3-year pillow contracts where he can leave after a year, would be great. I think it would make a lot of sense from a baseball standpoint just to have a little bit more stability there. Do I think they're going to do it? Absolutely not. I don't think they're interested in going over the initial tax threshold that you mentioned for a variety of reasons, money, stuff like that. But would I feel more comfortable about winning the division if we did have a Jordan? Yeah, absolutely I would. I feel like that would really kind of be a nice extra boost, because since the Cubs don't really have like an ace and then a 2 and then a 3, they got a lot of guys who are kind of in the 3-4 range, and having Montgomery there, I think would kind of help. Maybe he's like a 2-3 guy instead, like it would just help kind of pass over that. But I think they're going to skip on that idea. Hopefully Cade Horton by later in the year or August, September can come up and give them something. Hopefully they've got more options internally and in Assad and these other guys than they've had in the past. But it would really frustrate me if at the end of the year, like you were saying, if we miss the playoffs by one game, I can almost promise you it's going to be because of the rotation. At some point broke down, or there were multiple injuries at once, or whatever happened. So it's just sort of and maybe it's a situation they correct at the trading deadline, right? So there are other potential opportunities to improve there, but I don't see them doing it before. I think if they were going to, they probably could have done it by now, frankly. Now, if you were to sign Montgomery or Snell, who has a little Tyler Chatwood in him, but also like a little Cy Young in him. So, it's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde, but those guys aren't going to start the season in a rotation. They're going to start the season in extended spring training or something, right? Because they, haven't pitched yet. So I think the Cubs are probably at this point just going to go with what they have.
I think you make a good point about, it's funny when you ask me about the rotation and I immediately start talking about, I love the depth this year. That's sort of the part you're not saying implicitly in that is, it's not that I don't love the front four. It's just that, as you rightly point out, they all come with sort of a, hey, it could go really well if this. And, they all have a little bit to that. And you can easily talk yourself into all four of that. Why all four? Justin Steele's going to do it again. Shota's going to translate really well. Kyle Hendricks is back. He's healthy. And Jameson Taillon was fantastic in the second half. And he'll just do that again. You can talk yourself into it, but we know baseball and it will not play out that way. And I think we all know too, that the Cubs will have how many guys are going to make starts for them this year? 10, 12, it'll be a substantial number. And so it's easy to look at the rotation and say, well, they have the four and then they've got these other four guys competing for five. That's enough. But if a guy like Jordan Montgomery's out there, you hate the idea of letting the opportunity go when you could feel like you have a more front-loaded rotation. So I'm with you, Pat, on that. I just think it's not going to happen.
Yeah, so he's not a sexy pickup, but by God, that guy's a 30 start kind of solid guy. You can sort of what they hoped for in Taillon, I think, a little bit. Like in terms of what they thought they could get. The other thing I think that we don't want to forget, although it's easy to because it's been a long time, Marcus Stroman was lights out in the first half last year. He was an all-star. I mean, he carried this team. Remember that Padres game where they won like 1-0 because he just pitched the whole game and stopped that losing streak? I mean, he was just so good. And because of the injury and his finish, we kind of probably left with less than a positive overall image of what happened last year. But boy, in April, May, and June, I mean, he was just ridiculously good.
Yeah, the Cubs are almost going to have to hope not only that Shota Imanaga replaces that performance in terms of slot in the rotation, but that the bullpen takes a big step forward this year. Because, we saw last year that not only did the bullpen, the sort of key parts of the bullpen get so worn out because David Ross, maybe too much, but had to keep leaning on the same guys again and again and again in these tight games. But also, if you're not getting length from the starting pitchers, that's by default going to happen. Your bullpen's going to get stressed. And I don't know that this rotation is built to have a ton of length again this year, which is not me. I like these guys, but in most rotations don't have length anymore these days. But I think the bullpen is going to have to play a part in protecting the rotation, just like the rotation is going to have to play a part in protecting the bullpen.
That's where Assad and Wisniewski can come in handy, I think, even if they're not starting, is in that critical role that you give them a couple of innings, which is more and more common with teams in general. It's not just the Cubs, obviously, that pitching the sixth and the seventh inning of a game can really help quite a bit.
Brett, we talked about how spring training is to find the things that are fun. And one thing that's been super fun for me has been seeing the 2023 first round pick of the Cubs, Matt Shaw, play baseball. This has been so much fun. What a what a feel-good story, seeing him come up, have success, and I love watching the enthusiasm when the young guys are getting their shot here. So
who needs Matt Chapman when you've got Matt Shaw, right?
when you got Matt Shaw,
Bingo.
yeah. So this is the new Matt Shaw podcast, where we will be following him very closely. Big fans here. Your thoughts, Brett, on the infield in general? We'll cover all the first, third, DH. Your thoughts in general so far from the spring?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you brought up Matt Shaw in that, because the thing I think about a lot in the infield for the Cubs right now is third base. I think we feel good about second base. We feel good about shortstop. First base, it's whether I feel good or not. I don't think about it as much because I know what the Cubs are doing there. They acquired Michael Busch, paid a pretty decent prospect cost to acquire him to be the first baseman. So that is his. He will sit against some tough lefties, and that'll either be Patrick Wisdom or Garrett Cooper, or someone will be that right-handed partner for him. But first base is squared away for now. But third base is one of those fascinating stories this spring, because Christopher Morel is getting a shot to play there consistently in spring. He's taking all of his reps, both in games and on the backfields. He's exclusively been a third baseman this spring. And I think that speaks a little more to Craig Counsell wanting to commit to giving Morel a shot there, like a full focus there. Not that the Cubs necessarily yet are convinced that he's definitely going to be like the third baseman long term. And so I'll be fascinated to see how that plays out rest of spring and into the season. I really hope the Cubs give him a lot of runway so that he can play with the confidence of, they're not going to take me off of third base because I threw one away, because he's going to throw one away. He's probably going to throw a few of them away.
Maybe 30.
But yeah, some of those rate, if you take his performance at third base the last 2 years in the bigs, and then also his winter league third base performance, and you extrapolate that over a season. And I love Christopher Morel, but it's like scary bad. It's actually really, really bad. So hopefully, because with his athleticism and his arm, he can improve with dedicated focus there. But if he can't, that's when you start thinking about Matt Shaw. And I'm not necessarily talking about this year, but I'm not talking about this year because we saw last season in his draft year, this is a preternaturally gifted bat. It's clear, because to pair the kind of power he has with his barrel control, with his pitch recognition, with his discipline, with his sense of opportunities when you're really going to be, trying to make some authoritative contact, is really noticeable. I mean, you really only have to watch him play a few times, and you really start to see it. And so I will be very interested to see what happens to Morel. I will be very interested to see how much Shaw is playing third base, AA, AAA this year. And then seeing how the Cubs coordinate that in either later this year or in the years ahead.
Pat,
I'll one up you on that. I was going to say, I remember back in 2003 when the Marlins brought up a young third baseman who was like 21 years old in August and September, named Miguel Cabrera. You might remember him.
I have no memories.
Defeat the Cubs.
I have no memories
in
of
the playoffs.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But yeah, that's Matt Shaw. He's a Hall of Famer. That's what I'm saying. He's a 3,000 hit, 500 homer Hall of Famer. He comes up in August and he takes over, right? That's pretty much how that works. I did see this came out today. Craig Counsell said on MLB Network Radio, he said, quote, about the third base situation. He said, it's not going to be solved in spring training, but it will become clear over the long run. And he said he'd been pleased with the consistency of Morel's defense so far. So that kind of, I think, buttresses your point, Brett, that he wants to give Morel as much of an opportunity. We know what Patrick Wisdom can and cannot do at third base. We know what Nick Madrigal can and cannot do. Give Morel all the opportunities, all the reps you can, see how it goes. Know that, he'll probably play some DH. He'll probably, sit a few games too. But unlike last year, at least he won't be rotting away, hitting like 400 home runs in AAA for the first 6 weeks of the season when he could be up here. He'll be here in playing in some role or some capacity. And the good news is, although he may not be a good third baseman defensively, he'd be replacing guys who are also not good third basemen defensively, like Patrick Wisdom, for example. I know Madrigal did a little bit better statistically, like last year at third base than sort of what it looked like. But even so, I don't think people look at him as a Gold Glover. So it's not like you've got this fantastic defensive third baseman, this great Leatherman who you're benching for Morel. It's like, it's just guys, right, at this point. So less pressure in that front. And also, Morel's got some athleticism the other two don't have. So just because he makes a lot of errors doesn't mean he can't also make some plays. I mean, the Javi Baez syndrome. Remember, Baez would make great plays, and he'd throw some away. But in the long run, it certainly played well when he started out at third, and then when he moved around and, ended up playing, second and then short?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I like the idea of you want to get your best lineup in. And I don't think – one thing I don't think Cub fans want is to play the entire month of May where they average like 1 run a game, right? Like, so having Morel in the lineup every day, whether it's at third base or DH, almost every day, I think is really – it has to be part of the overall plan. And to your point about first base, they've got guys, right? We're hoping Bush can really kind of grow into the role. That would be amazing because that's sort of what they need. They need one of these guys to hit, and he's the oldest, so he should be next, in terms of maturity-wise, ready to go. And they've been augmenting it with veterans who they can bring up, like you mentioned. They also have that Matt Mervis guy who I guess is buried now. Is he even going to play in AAA? Like, I don't know what do they do with him? They've really put themselves in a pickle, haven't they?
I think they've got to find him a home somewhere. I think it's a Nelson Velasquez situation again, where, if Morel's playing third base, DH is wide open. That does allow you more flexibility in how you create the roster in terms of the bench. So I don't want to rule anything out, but you're right. If the Cubs are looking at Bush as a long-term first baseman, if the Cubs are giving Owen Casey reps at first base, and we know he's going to be at AAA, and we know they like Hayden McGeary, and he's going to be at first base at AAA.
Yeah.
Then you got Mervis, who, that's where he would be, right? If they keep him, that's where he's got to be. And I'm not saying they couldn't coordinate all that at Iowa, but is that doing right by him? Is that doing right by your organizational value? Is that maximizing his value? We saw what they did last year with Nelson Velasquez. It's not that they didn't like him. It's not that they didn't think he could be a good big leaguer. It's that they looked at their situation and they're like, he's never going to get playing time in our outfield. It's just not going to happen. So they turned him into a reliever I really like in Jose Cuas. And if the Cubs could do something like that with Mervis, I think it would be maybe the best thing for him and maybe the best thing for them too.
Last question.
He's going to be 26 years old in a month. And I think, if you can't, as a left-handed bat, make this team, be raft of left-handed bats, especially left-handed power bats, that's probably a sign that this isn't your home, right?
Last question, Brett, and then we'll let you get going. We really appreciate the time. We want to get your thoughts. Again, this is the optimistic part of the season. We want to get your upcoming season expectations. Where does this team finish? What are the expectations you're putting on this team heading into the regular season?
I think ultimately, although they didn't do quite as much as I would have liked to have seen this offseason, given the way the division is setting up and given the opportunity of having brought in Craig Counsell, who I do think is uniquely valuable as a manager, I still think this is the best on-paper team in the Central. And that is not me being overly hypey about the Cubs. It's me looking at the rest of the division, and I see significant warts everywhere. And the Cubs have them too, but I know that the projection systems and Vegas have the Cardinals as sort of a pretty solid favorite. I don't get that. I look at that roster and I think, okay, will they be better than last year? Absolutely. But are they an 87 to 90 win team? I don't see where that's coming from. And so I think
somehow they get rid of Wainwright and Molina and somehow get older. Yeah.
Yeah. They are. They're definitely testing the value of veteran presence. And I think that it's going to be a division where you might see one team start to nibble 90 wins, but it might be another year where it takes 87 or 88 to win. And I don't know. I look at this Cubs team and I can see 87 wins. I can see 88 wins. I don't think that's so outlandish, especially when, and let's see if I can articulate this right, because I struggle to make this point in a way that lands with a majority of folks. So last year, we know how many games the Cubs actually won, right? But the underlying performance and sort of how you would extrapolate from that suggested that their true talent was closer to a 90-win team last year. When you try to project this year and you're talking about true talent, you're talking about sort of statistically likely outcomes, it's almost like that's the baseline you should be starting from when you talk about the offseason moves and the things that have changed. Because people always talk about, well, they were an 83-win team and they did this and they did this, so they're just still 83 wins. It's like, no. And if you simulated last season 100 times, they win more than 83 games, most of those simulations. And especially if they had Craig Counsell as a manager. Sorry, I love David Ross for a lot of reasons, but I think that there were some ways that perhaps Counsell would have really helped the 2023 Cubs. So anyway, that is all to say. I just don't like the idea of suggesting that the Cubs were transforming an 83-win team, because that's not how the projection models work. So I think this is a good, solid 85, 86 win team. You know, if you're looking at the bell curve, that's the median mark. But those teams often win 87 or 88. And certainly Craig Counsell led Brewers teams have done that for a decade. And so we hope that may port over to the Cubs.
One of the things that kind of did the Cubs in early on last year was the bullpen disarray. You know, the Fulmer experiment. They blew a lot of games early in the year, and they were sort of one of those teams that couldn't afford to blow an inordinate number of games just based on their overall, situation. And that's where a lot of these Pythagorean theorem disappointments came in, I think, too. When the Cubs won games last year, they blew teams. I mean, they had like 20 games where they scored more than 10 or more runs. It was really pretty amazing.
They were one of the most blowout-y teams in baseball.
Yeah, and when they were cold, they were cold. But that the bullpen, if Alzolay is healthy and can be a closer, if they can have Neris, if you can take this, what I think is a little bit more of a reliable bullpen with like actual dedicated roles going into the season, I think that could potentially help them prevent a couple losses. Well, and this is one of the things when you're kind of picking guys up off the scrap heap year after year in the bullpen, sometimes you hit, sometimes you don't. But a lot of times it takes a month or two to figure out where the hits and misses were. And those are games that you're winning and losing at the same time. So hopefully this year they're not quite in that same position where they're going through that only to have to cut a guy in May because his ERA is 9. And that could help. The other thing that I want to ask you really quickly about the projections, because I haven't heard much about this from other people, but when I look at the Cubs and I look on paper, I agree. I don't think the Cardinals are a menacing team to the extent that a lot of the projections suggest they are. And the rest of the teams are poor, which is too bad for them. But one of the wild cards to me, and it's true of every single team in this division, is that every team in this division has a significantly large quantity or at least impactful quality of young players who either, like with the Cardinals, came up last year, the Jordan Walker types. Who knows what he'll do as a second-year player. But the Brewers have some elite level prospects, and the Pirates have a pitcher who could be all world, and the Reds have just a bunch of young guys. And so how these guys all sort of it's almost like this arms race, whoever develops their prospects the best could surprise, I think, a lot of teams, especially if they can get 3 or 4 guys to hit.
Fantastic point, because that is the biggest driver in surprise teams every year. It's not injuries, it's not veteran resurgences. It's these teams that have a group of young players that maybe pop a little earlier than expected or were under-evaluated coming up. And I think it isn't just because we're close to it, that that we think the NL Central is loaded with those groups. It is. You look at all the prospect rankings and stuff. The NL Central is uniquely situated in that respect, and I think you're totally right that it's very hard to predict when 3 or 4 or 5 of those guys might all take a step forward at the same time, especially in a game that's getting younger and younger every year. Like I wouldn't rule out
the team. Like the Pirates are probably a bad team. Like Bryant, and like the third baseman Hayes, and then the shortstop
O'Neal Cruz coming back from injury. Yeah, Henry Davis.
They could be very good.
He's crushing it this spring, and like you said, Paul Skeens is potentially superstar.
He could be the next Strasburg, according to some people.
For sure. And I think if we were having this conversation in August, right, and say that the Pirates are on track to win 90 games, the national discourse would be, wow, these Pirates came out of nowhere. And, well, kind of, it might be a low probability event, but we know as we sit here today in early March that it is possible that that's going to happen. We wouldn't project it. It would be on the lower end of that bell curve of projections. But you're right. It makes predicting this division very difficult because the Cubs are one of those teams too, right? If they had a bunch of guys really pop, boom, they're a 90+ win team. But you just hope that doesn't happen for any of the teams, or if it happens for any of them, it's only the Cubs.
Sure, and you feel like the Cubs have a base level of talent greater than that of the Reds and the Brewers and Pirates, so that helps. But then you get into that. Well, hopefully our young guys, because we talk a lot about, and you see a lot in Cubs sort of social media circles about the Cubs young players and how great they're going to be and how that's going to propel the team, which hopefully will all be true. But oftentimes I think we do that at the expense of also recognizing that there are other players that are young on other teams that are also going to be good. So it's almost like we need some of our young guys to do well just to make sure we stay ahead of some of these other teams.
Yeah, to put a pin in that, I would point out for everybody who celebrates that the Cubs generally are seen as having the second best farm system in baseball right now behind the Orioles, the Brewers are generally seen as having the third best, and those margins are not significant. And so it is only fair, if we want to eat this cake, we have to recognize this one too.
Brett, always a great time catching up with you and talking Cubs. Please remind our listeners all the places they can find your work on the internet.
Yeah, thanks. Well, best place is at Bleacher Nation. I'm the lead Cubs writer there, and I manage our Twitter/X account. And those are definitely your best places to find me pretty regularly. And I love doing this too, guys. I appreciated you having me on.
And
Always
it's the Bleacher
pleasure.
Nation empire. It's not just baseball. You've also got football and basketball. And with the draft coming up for the NFL, go to Bleacher Nation for NFL news. Bears news.
Yes. If you want to obsess about Justin Fields and Caleb Williams, we've got that too, for sure.
Thanks a lot, Brett. Really appreciate it.
All right. Take care, guys.
Take care.
Always a good time catching up with Brett. It's been too long. He hasn't been on the pod since episode 194, so it's been a while.
There you go.
So, yeah, good to have him back. Any last thoughts, anything you want to discuss before we wrap it up and call it a podcast this week?
Well, I think in our next episode, we'll really start getting into or finishing up each episode with a recap of the 84 Cubs, the 40 years ago Cubs. I will tell you that 40 years ago today, the Cubs were sucking in spring training. They were not winning any games, just so if that's any relief. And next week would be the 40-year anniversary of the retirement of Cub pitcher Fergie Jenkins, who called it a career just before if he had only known, right, what would become eventful 1984 season. So, but that same Cubs team in '84 had yet to even make the three largest trades of the year. In fact, one of them would be coming up in a couple of weeks that we'll talk about, and then there'll be a couple more during the season. So a lot can happen between now and the end of the trading deadline. And that is just as true today as it was 40 years ago. So hopefully the Cubs will be paying attention to that. And I do think, as Brett pointed out, like the Matt Mervis situation, maybe Drew Smiley, a couple other guys, if the Cubs can get creative, I think they might do some roster juggling in order to clear up a little bit of space and to give some other guys an opportunity with other teams that are getting buried in their own system, which isn't the worst thing, frankly. There was a time when the Cubs had Rizzo at first and no one else in the minors at first base, remember? So the fact that Mervis has competition with a couple other guys, tells you all you need to know about some depth, I guess, in the organization.
Excellent. And we want to remind everybody, first of all, thank everybody who went out to the YouTube channel where we're now posting video versions of this podcast. We got a lot of new subscribers after last week's debut video podcast episode. So thank you to everyone who came out and subscribed.
I would subscribe, Jeremy, but I don't know how. Could you explain it to me?
You go out and you smash the button, like the kids say today. Like, subscribe, all that stuff. Work an algorithm so other Cub fans can find the show.
How would my parents find it? Tell people how you can find the YouTube channel.
You go to youtube.com and you search Wrigleyville Nation Podcast. It will pop right up for you. You can subscribe right there if you consume your podcast via video form. If you don't, we could still use those subscribes, everything there. So thank you to everyone for continuing to support the show there. And you can support the show as well at our Patreon, patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. That is how we keep this show ad-free every single season. We're going into another season where we're not running ads because we are listener-supported 100%. Every single dollar goes right back into the show, and we appreciate it. We've been able to pay our hosting fees and mic cables and anything we need is all because of the support of our listeners, so we have not had to run ads, and we are looking for another season. So if you can support the show there, patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. If you can't support the show financially in these times, we understand as well. Make sure you tell your Cub fan friends about the show. Show them how to subscribe to the podcast. You can find us anywhere podcasts are found. So make sure you're telling your friends about it. Spread the word. That's a free way to support the show. And also, those 5-star reviews help as well. So make sure you're doing all the things that can help us as we get ready for the baseball season. We'll be back every single week here starting right after spring training. So our prediction episode, and then we're on it every single week, Pat.
All right, sounds good.
And with that, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to call it a podcast. I want to thank Brett Taylor again for joining us. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.